So our main news today, ministers are facing increased calls to do more about the cost of fuel as the price of petrol and diesel in the UK reaches record highs.
The average now price of petrol hit a new peak of 173 pence a litre. The price of diesel rose to 183 pence a litre.
Now, this means the price of filling up a typical family car with diesel has gone above £100 for the first time.
Now, despite the Chancellor issuing a 5p fuel duty cut earlier this year, prices have continued to rise, in large part due, of course, to the war in Ukraine.
But the Prime Minister is also reportedly concerned that the cut is not being passed on to customers at many pumps, so he's drawing up plans to expose firms that aren't reducing their prices in line with that.
Well, joining us to discuss this more is the founder of Frank Investments, Paul Sedgwick, who's in the studio. Thank you very much.
Good morning.
For many families, this is just yet another thing where they think, in my average week, the cost of doing the very basics, doing the school run, driving to work, has become now extortionately expensive.
I mean, obviously, rising oil prices have all sorts of implications across not only domestic but businesses and industry. It is in effect a taxation on your cost of living, absolutely.
So what can be done about this in the immediate term, if anything?
Well, to be honest, in a way, not a great deal. I mean, unfortunately, the reason that the price of oil and gas is rising because of the consequences of the war between Russia and the Ukraine. And while that continues and while supplies are disrupted, then obviously when you have a limited supply of anything, prices begin to rise. And that is what we've seen.
In terms of how the economy works, though, you'll know much better than I. At what point would the government turn around and say, well, if we reduce fuel duty more, it's going to get people back out, be better for the economy?
Well, obviously, any help that the government can give in terms of reducing the fuel duty and making it bringing prices down does help, because, as I said, the impact of higher oil prices we always see. History tells you that rising oil prices does have an economic impact and does slow down the economy. All parts of the way. Big truck drivers, people driving to work, everything. It is a tax on your income.
That 5 pence levy, why isn't that being filtrated down to us at the pumps?
Well, I don't know the answer to that question, but what I would say is that, unfortunately, I mean, you can drive not very far away from two petrol stations and probably find a 5p difference in the price of the fuel. So I think that, I mean, obviously anything that helps, but they're trying to ensure that that 5p is passed on is important, but it's a sort of 2 or 3% decrease on the cost of your fuel.
I mean, we're talking oil prices here, and we see it directly every time we have to fill up the car. But of course, it's playing into our fuel bills at home, and now they're even talking about about 6 million households, perhaps by the end of the year, because of all this, the way this is amalgamating, is potential fuel rationing.
Yeah, I know. The government have said that the possibility of this is relatively low, but obviously that is a serious consequence. I mean, in lots of ways, if you do have fuel rationing, I mean, I remember back in the 70s when we turned off our. You're way too young for that, but
I'm not.
Well, you look it anyway. But the fact is, it has a terrible impact. I mean, a personal impact and people being able to heat their homes and stay warm and all that sort of thing, and also the fact that productivity will drop, which further adds to the risk of an economic recession, which people are already worried about.
People are particularly worried about the winter that's coming, with the energy cap being reviewed again in October. What can the government do now to try and best mitigate against the worst-case scenario?
Well, I think that what they've got to try and do is the best they can to ensure as much of the supply of oil and gas is secured in various ways. I mean, obviously, one of the things that the country is not so good on is storage and improving storage. We're talking about increasing, hopefully, some investments in some of the North Sea again. But, I mean, Rishi Sunak's tax that he introduced on this windfall tax may impact that as well. So that could be a consequence, but that wouldn't come on in the short term. I think In the longer term, I think this may increase investment in renewable energies and try and find other ways. And it'll be interesting to see what the economic consequences are, because if we do, I mean, the EU last night said they're going to look to phase out importing Russian oil and gas by the end of the year. Russia said that they may threaten back and reduce exports of gas, and this is why the concern is over rationing. But it may mean that in the future, down the longer term, Russia may do more harm to its own economy than it thinks, because of the fact that it will, people will find alternative ways of getting oil and gas.
In terms of the pound in our pocket, what are you advising people to do? In terms of prioritising and investments or anything else, really?
Well, investments is such a broad space, because the important thing with investments is always trying to match it up with your needs and your requirements, and trying to make sure that your investment strategy marries up with what you're looking to do in the longer term, and saving and making sure that you have where you can something to look after you, and as they say, on a rainy day. But it's very hard when you talk about investments. And I was listening to one of your programmes the other day, and somebody was saying at the moment, people trying to find ways to save. It's hard when you're trying to meet your bills at the current.
I mean, this is the problem. So saving for a rainy day. It's what I was always taught to do.
Yeah,
you've got to have that extra cash to save for the rainy day.
And that's why I say, saving, you've got to think ahead. But you're right. At the moment, it's a hard thing to think about.
Mm.
Just slightly on the bigger, broader picture of this, there is this real tension, isn't there, with our sort of green commitments and also the pledging from the government to say we're going to do the very best we can to make sure we don't have things like power rationing come, this winter. That's an awkward tension to balance.
Well, at the moment we've got all sorts of tension. I mean, I think on the one hand we want to be seen, Europe needs to be seen to be staying strong in its support of Ukraine and the sanctions that are imposed, but they have economic consequences for the countries imposing them. And we've seen this. But you're right. I mean, but in the short term, as I said earlier, you may see that the focus will increase in trying to move further away from oil and gas, because of, countries have become more aware of how reliant they are on it. And, it wasn't so long ago that you had oil price trading at $30 or $40 a barrel, and everybody's saying, well, we're never going to use the stuff again. And now, there's a terrible shortage. Commodities tend to go in these cycles. But at the moment, it's obviously very painful.
Yeah, no, it is indeed. Look, Paul, good to see you this morning. Thank you. I think we're catching up with you a little bit later on as well, aren't we?
Thanks very much. Nice to meet you.
You get to come back again, because the second day in a row, someone thought I wasn't around in the 70s. We'll have you back.
You see how well it's obviously
it's working. This is what you need to do to keep coming back on. Something's working for me. I don't know what.
I'd take it.
No, take it.
Stop highlighting it. Do you know? Let people believe it and carry on.